Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the All Systems Go podcast. I'm your host, of course, Chris L. Davis. And on this episode, I've got a new friend. And the reason why I can say friend so quickly, everybody, I don't use that word lightly, but it's because we immediately connected over our love and usage of automation. Okay. So today's guest is Joe Casabona. He is a podcast and automation coach who helps coaches, course creators, and authors grow their podcasts into authority building lead generators. He does that through expert tested systems that come with 10 years of experience podcasting, 15 years teaching, and over 20 years working with the web. Can you all see how we just bonded so quickly? All right, you can learn more about him at casabona.org. Joe is here on this episode to teach us about effective podcast strategies for growth. Joe, welcome to the podcast, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for that intro. I appreciate it. Yeah, we're like kindred spirits. Like we had one call and we're like, man, did we just become best friends?
Yep. That's all it took, man. That's all it took. So I'm glad to have you on the podcast. I had the pleasure of being on yours. And listeners, just let me say this. We have to be disciplined because Joe and I can literally just keep going, sharing strategies. On one of our calls, I showed him some of my podcast stuff. Before this call, he just showed me some stuff that blew my mind in Make, and we're talking about workflows for automating graphic design. It gets dangerous quick with us, all right? So I had to put the pause on it and say, wait a minute, Joe. Our listeners need to know about podcasting, and mainly because what I found is, I started my podcast when I was working at Active Campaign as the director of education. And at that time, Joe, there were no video. YouTube wasn't doing podcasts. Podcasts were literally if you were in iTunes. That's it. And everybody associated it that way. So it wasn't as open as it is now, right? Like if you don't have a RSS feed today, you could still have a podcast. Like people don't care about the technical structure and
Yeah.
backing. They're like, every week I go to YouTube and click a button and I watch his podcast. I'm like, well, that's a video. Oh, okay. Anyways, podcast. I get it. So in that, what I learned roughly was as a digital marketer, I was frustrated with how hard it was to track performance. And since I couldn't track performance, it was very hard to like optimize. And I had to learn all of these strategies with like using redirect URLs within your podcast and, taking time within it to do a like an ad yourself and the things of that nature. I don't do all of the strategies that I know, but it's been very hard. It's been very hard. The platforms like Apple and Google and everything, they're very tight with their analytics, and definitely it's all anonymous. You'll never know from them who's doing what. So I
Right.
thought it would be very appropriate to have you on, man, and just really help us podcasters and aspiring podcasters who also have a love for automation on how to navigate this space. You've been doing it for a while. You know what, Joe? I'll just jump right in. I know you. They don't. And they've heard about your experience. Just give us the 10,000 foot view of what your path into podcasting consisted of.
Yeah. So I think I have always been two things, right? From a very young age. I've been a person who likes to use technology to solve problems,
Yep.
and I've been an entertainer. Like I used to. This is a very not well known story, but in second grade, I went to Catholic school my whole
Hmm.
life, like pre-K through grad school. Um, and in second grade, I would put my sweater over my head and I would tell people to call me Sister Josephine. I thought it was like a funny bit going to school in the 1990s. And my teacher, Miss McCullough, now she's Sister Mary, actually. She ended up becoming a nun. Um, she asked me if I knew what drama club was. And I said,
Mm.
no. And she said, stay after school today. I was in second grade. I assume they called my parents. Not something I thought of logistically. Um, but uh, she said, stay after school. We're meeting, the drama club's meeting. And I like fell in love, right? My first role was a munchkin in The Wizard of Oz.
Mm.
And so I loved entertaining. Um, Fast forward to post grad school, another passion I found was teaching. I really enjoyed teaching. I would teach my web design clients how to use um, their websites. I was a TA throughout grad school, and so I actually got an adjunct professor job at the University of Scranton, my alma mater.
Mm.
And I taught there for several years before moving away. When I moved away, I knew I wanted to keep teaching, and I knew I needed an outlet for entertaining. And so, even though I was still in the WordPress space, the web development space, um, I started a few online courses. And initially, I wanted to promote those online courses through my podcast. I owned a domain, howibuilt.it. I bought the domain on our honeymoon in Italy,
Mm.
just because I was like floored that nobody owned it.
Yep.
And so like I backed my podcast's name into that domain, and I was talking to a lot of friends in the WordPress space about how they started their online courses, and I thought I should make these public conversations. And so
Mm.
that is how that's how I got into podcasting um, properly. Like I had a podcast in 2012 where it was just like me and a couple of dudes talking about like nothing that we actually knew about, and
Yeah.
but that was like that was like practice, you know. So
Yep. Yep. Now for me, like I mentioned when I got into it, I'm coming as a marketer. I'm tasked by this company that I'm working for to start a podcast. So first off, I was overwhelmed with all of the equipment. I didn't know what microphones to use. I never used an XLR microphone in terms of podcasts. I had experience with them in the music industry, but not, in podcasting. We're in one room. How do you sit? How do I cancel out the voice? What I didn't know what an audio interface was. So there was an entire learning on that side. And once I got all of that done, I was kind of like, that was a check mark. I know how to podcast. And then once you start to run the episodes, that's when I realized, wait a minute, how do I know how it's performing? So for you, how long, when you got started properly, how long was it before you started to realize, like, wait a minute, this is not like a website where I can see where people are going and, get email addresses easily? What was that awareness like for you?
yeah, that was really interesting, right? So I use Libsyn. I
Mm-hmm.
used Libsyn to host my podcast then.
Yep.
I mean, this was 2016, but again, like my first podcast I launched in like 2012.
Yep.
Um and so like they were like the OG for a very long time. Like they were like the
Yes.
only game in town.
Yep. Yep.
And so I would obsess over download numbers, right? So and like downloads
Mm.
are not listeners, are not viewers, are not. It's just
Yeah. Some apps
it's
are
a
auto
number.
download. Like I
Yeah,
could never
right.
listen to it. The app will auto download it. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. This was before Apple Podcasts had any engagement. Spotify wasn't even around. Well, wasn't doing podcasts yet. And so that was maybe one of the early mistakes I made, was thinking like downloads meant engagement.
Mm.
And so
Wow.
I hit 100,000 downloads in the first 9 months, which is still really good, right? It's like more than most.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought like 100,000 downloads in the first 9 months, I'm gonna launch a membership and charge people $5 a month. And like two people bought it. Uh, and I was like, all right, maybe 100,000
Yeah.
downloads is not mass market penetration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it takes a little more, right? Than just say, "Hey, I got this thing,"
Yeah,
go get it.
yeah.
And
And
now all these hundreds of people paying me.
I would say today, like my membership still isn't where it needs to be,
Mm-hmm.
or where I'd like it to be. Um, but one of the things I learned about doing a membership, right, is like early on, until you get a lot of members where it's worth it, um, do low effort for you, high value for the listener. And
Yeah.
so like ad free extended episodes, um, low effort for me. right?
Yeah. Yeah.
About to get lower effort for me actually, since I moved to a new podcast host that has dynamic ad insertion. But um, and so it's like that and like a weekly newsletter column
Hmm.
um for members only, and so that's like pretty low effort for me. That's stuff I'm already writing about, or making like the sawdust of my business available for the members. And so
Yeah.
um but that's like still something I'm trying to build up a bit more.
Yeah. 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 So for you, you have that awareness. Okay, well, wait a minute, downloads aren't everything, but then you also start to see themes and observe, and you do a lot of testing. It goes without saying, but you do a lot of testing and experimenting. And as you were doing that, and I want to put the new podcaster as an avatar for you, the me of old, that their achievement, and they put their flag down the minute their first episode or episodes were seen in iTunes or Apple Podcasts. They're like, whew, I made it. I have a podcast. And they have no idea how to grow from there
Hmm.
and what it entails. Give them a little bit of the anatomy of a growing or a growed up
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah. So right, this is like another hard fought lesson that
Mm-hmm.
I want you to skip over, right? Is um I don't want you to fight for it. I mean, and it was I took a very field of dreams approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I build it, they will come.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think in 2016 I hit a little bit better. I got a little lucky
Mm.
because I picked the right topic.
Yes.
I was more dedicated to quality than most podcasters were at that time.
Mm.
And I probably benefited a little bit from about 3 months after my show launched. Um, NPR launched a show called How I Built This. So my show is called
Mm.
How I Built It.
Yeah.
Their show is called How I Built This.
Yeah.
And so maybe I benefited from quote unquote brand confusion, but the data point I look at there is that I didn't see like massive amounts of downloads one week and then no downloads the next week, right? I saw very
Yeah.
consistent growth. And so even if people were finding my show because of that search, they were sticking around because of the good content. And so
Nice.
um I talk about, it's like a 7-point framework for podcast growth.
Okay.
I think the first thing you need to do is get your mission right. You need to
Mm.
know, especially today, who you're talking to and what problem you're trying to solve for those people. 78% of people listen to podcasts to learn something new.
Mm.
And so, unless you're a big production agency, like Wondery or Art 19, where you have the capital to do a highly produced fiction or true crime or other
Yeah.
deeply researched thing, you need to be solving a problem for somebody. This is also the way that you're going to establish your authority, right? So I think the first thing you need to do is define the problem you're trying to solve. I like to put it in the um, context of a mission statement. My
Mm.
podcast helps audience solve problem by, and then fill in the blank with with each episode, right?
Yeah.
So my podcast helps creators make money through their creator business by interviewing successful creators about how they do it, right? By
Yeah.
offering free coaching calls from successful creators.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that's the number one thing you need to do, right?
Yeah.
We can, like, I was just talking for a long time. We can
I
stop there if
know.
you want.
I want to jump in
Yeah.
because this is very important, because I was just on a podcast. I was on a podcast, and as a guest, you help me be better. If you let me know your audience, right? Let me know, are they technical or not, like where they stand, so I can frame my appearance and all of my educating and value appropriately. And I finished up with this podcast. They didn't really have a clear defined avatar or goal, or
Mhm.
hey, let's just talk about some stuff. And afterwards, let me tell you, Joe, I went to the website and looked at the other one, like the other podcast guests, and they were all over the place. They were doing real estate, business development, growth, and I'm like, you know what? Their audience, you asked me to go techie with this audience, and I probably overwhelmed them. So if you don't
Yeah.
know the mission, what problem you solving for who, one is going to be very hard for you to instruct and get true value out of your guests. And two, as a podcaster, it's going to be very hard to find guests if somebody approaches you and say, "Hey, what kind of guests are you looking for?" And you're like, "Oh, anybody with a mic, as long as they got a good internet connection and they're in business."
Yep.
That's tough to really produce a valuable podcast.
Yeah. And then you're not making people want to come back, right? You're not.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons my show grew so much in the beginning, right? It was very focused in the beginning. And here's a little more anecdote than hard data backed, right? But I got a bunch of downloads in the beginning because I was interviewing WordPress developers on how they built their WordPress business, right? So like
Yeah.
WordPress developers, I knew who I was talking to.
Yeah.
Then I felt like I ran my course through the WordPress developers. I
Mm,
wanted to diversify, right? Somebody pointed out that I only had white guys on the show, and I was like, that. I mean,
mm,
that's like, it's a valid, um, it's a valid criticism,
yeah.
and it was like a function of like, well, I'm a white developer guy, and I know mostly white developer guys, right? Um,
Right.
and so going outside of developers, I was able to find more a more diverse crowd, and so
Yeah.
I started talking about marketing and building your business, but then I generalized, right? And my
Mm.
downloads dipped. And it was very
Ooh.
obvious. I lost people who were really interested in just WordPress development.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense.
Last year, I changed again. I did like this kind of glacial shift from WordPress developer businesses to WordPress businesses to creator businesses, right?
Mm.
And so I went narrow to wide, back to narrow. My monthly downloads from January 2022 to December 2022 doubled from 34,000 a month to 75,000 a month. Um,
Wow.
and so knowing who you're talking to, right? Because then you're solving a problem. Then you're like, oh man, I don't know how to build a community. Oh, you know what? I just heard this great podcast episode from a guy who interviews creators.
Yes. Yes.
Here's how to build a community from an expert in that field.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so I think that's really important. Episode titles and descriptions are also going to be really important, even more now that Spotify is like trying to put this front and center and
Yeah.
YouTube is getting into podcasting. You can't just
Yes.
have like episode 123 John Smith, right? Like who
Mm-hmm.
cares?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It has to be like why your community is failing with Drew Dillon, right? I don't know
Yeah.
if that's the actual episode, what I called it, but like that's attention grabbing, right?
Yeah.
So you need to think about that. So those are like the little technical, like the SEO quote unquote level changes you need to
Mm-hmm.
make. Know your
Mm-hmm.
audience. Make sure to position your content so that it's so that people want to actually listen to it and won't just scroll on by it. Your
Yeah.
first 60 seconds are going to be really important, right? You got that cold open. You need to grab people in that first 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Pre-roll ad notwithstanding, right? People will just skip that
Yeah.
um, if they want to, or they'll listen to it, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but there is one, I believe, tried and true method. I think a lot of people believe. I've gotten pushback from a couple of people on LinkedIn about this kind of effectiveness.
Yeah.
Um, but there is like one tried and true method. I know I've kind of been talking a lot, so I don't
No,
want to be
no,
one of those guests that just talks the
this
whole
is your
time.
show, man. I
Yeah.
intentionally am quiet so the guests can have the highlight. They hear me
Yeah.
enough.
Awesome. Um, so I think a tried and true method is podcast swaps, right? And so
Mm.
Chris and I are doing this, right? A
Yeah.
little unintentionally, right?
Right.
This is
Right.
not we got connected through someone else, I think, who's had us both on his show. Um, but uh it kind of happened organically, but this is what you do, right? You reach out to other podcasters and you ask if you want to do a promo swap with them.
Yeah.
Um, there are really four kind of swaps, right? There's the promo swap where I'll use Chris and me as examples so that I'm not like talking in uber generalities.
Hmm.
Chris will do a 30-second promo of my show at the top of his show. I'll do a 30-second promo of Chris's show, this show, on the top of my show, right? So hey, if you like this, and I've been talking about automation, like definitely check out Chris's show, All Systems Go, wherever you listen to podcasts or at this link, right? Then you could do guest swaps. That's what you and I are doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're both going on each other's shows. I've already mentioned my podcast. I know you mentioned yours at the end. I'll link it in the show notes, etc.
Yeah.
And then there's crossover episodes, right, where you and the host, you and the other host, like, so you and I might get together and do one episode and then release the same episode on each other's feeds, right? And so
Oh,
yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is something I did with Nathan Wrigley from WP Builds podcast. I wrote a very strongly worded article about how I think virtual event speakers should be paid.
Mm-hmm.
And Nathan runs a pretty big virtual event where he doesn't pay his speakers. And I wasn't throwing shade at him necessarily. I think he does it better than most people who are like, oh yeah, speak for free. Also, you have to promote our event. Like anyone who's like, you have to email your letter. I'm like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I'm bringing the content. It's your job to bring the people. But anyway, so we decided that we were going to do a debate on this article and release it on both of our feeds. So we recorded just the debate, and then we added the bumpers and whatever our ad spots later.
Yep.
And the reason that these things work so effectively is because you are targeting lookalike audiences who are already listening to podcasts, right? Friends, I'm going to tell this story really quick. I love this story because I'm a 90s kid. Friends is my show, right? When Friends first came out in the 94-95 television season, right? They were on Thursday night TV. NBC's Thursday night lineup was legendary even then. So they had a slot there. They were getting maybe 17 to 18 million views on Thursday nights. Which sounds like a lot by today's standards, but I mean, that's what people did there was no streaming anything, right? You had 4 channels basically that you had to watch, right? So this is what people were doing. Then they had a 2-episode arc called The One with 2 Episodes. And in part 1, they had the cast of Mad About You on the show. Fun fact, Lisa Kudrow played Phoebe Buffay in Friends. She played Ursula Buffay, a snarky waitress in Mad About You. So in universe, they were twin sisters. But Helen Hunt and somebody else from the show went into Central Perk. In part 2, Rachel hurts her ankle and has to go to the hospital and is treated by 2 young doctors. Those doctors were George Clooney and Noah Weil from ER. After those 2 episodes, Friends averaged 26 per night. So they increased their viewership by 22% by doing the crossover event, right? Which NBC promoted, right? But like the important part here is that they were lookalike audiences. People who watched Mad About You, first of all, took place in New York City. Young 20-somethings trying to make it in the big city while working and managing their love life, right? ER, not a comedy, but still young 20-something professionals that took place in Chicago, trying to make it in a big city while trying to balance work and life and love. So it was really the same avatar that they were going out for. So when you understand your audience, you can effectively do podcast swaps. And that every time I did a podcast swap last year, I saw a bump in my downloads and my newsletter signups, and it was really effective.
Wow. These are good. I hadn't thought of the promo. Of course, I've done the guest. I've had extreme success with being a guest on others' podcasts. And then the what did you call it? The swap? What did you say it was?
The crossover.
Yeah, the crossover. The crossover, it sounds fun. It's like an event. It makes an episode an event. You've got collaboration, two people pushing to the same thing, and then what's the last one?
There's promo swaps, guest interviews, crossovers, and then feed swaps. I actually didn't mention that one, but feed
Okay.
swaps, that's basically where you and I would take an episode of each other's show and drop it in our feed. Right? So full episode.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Wondery and Stuff You Should Know do and I'm sorry, Wondery and iHeart do this a lot. Where they'll say
Oh,
like,
that's
"Hey,
cool.
today's episode's a little different and it's actually the full episode of this other podcast I think you'd really like." Um and then they just play the episode full. So you don't have to go anywhere. You just listen to it, and then if you like it, you could subscribe.
Wow. Wow. And this is why I have you on, because I think that most people do believe in the build it, they will come, more so of the record it and they will listen model,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I will be the first to raise their hand and say the amount of viewership that I thought I would get, even just based on people's response from my webinars, the companies I work for, and everything. I did not see a 1-to-1 when that translated into when I created my own podcast. In fact, and this speaks to, don't ever get satisfied or content with your marketing, because I have people. I was just posting on LinkedIn because you're part of the reboot of the podcast after we took a break, and one of my good friends, like somebody who I've literally met in person many times, and we have talked and, hey, let's get the family together. They're in the space of marketing as well. And it wasn't until LinkedIn where, I'm posting, it's like, oh, sorry, my bad. I should have been, subscribe. So you just can't assume reach when it comes
Right.
to podcasting. So when you hear things like, I know I can pretty much speak for almost everybody listening to this podcast right now, that nobody is doing all four of those things
Right.
that you just mentioned.
Right. And again, if you do those things, you will grow your podcast. It's kind of like this, right? People look at Apple Podcasts like YouTube, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the main difference is that YouTube actively recommends content.
Correct.
Apple
Yeah.
Podcasts does not. It's not a discovery engine. It's
Yeah.
like if Apple Podcasts is kind of like, like in Walmart or another big box store, like you have aisles where there are certain things, and then you have those giant bins of
Yeah.
just like $5 DVDs or
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
And then you have to like sift through them to find the one you like. That's kind of what podcast discovery is like. Someone needs to recommend something to me, or I need to sift through this big bin of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So podcast discovery is not good. Podcasting is not a good discovery platform. What it is great at is nurturing and building those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I always look at tech. I love my wife. I use her, though, as my barometer of, has this gone mainstream? Because she's not in the tech space. So I can truly leverage, hey, what are you doing? How are you using it? What have you heard of? And what else? Right. And we were having a conversation the other day, and she was like, yeah, I like listening to his podcast. I said, time out. When you say podcast, do you mean you just go to YouTube and like whatever's in your feed? She was like, no, in my phone. And when she said phone, it meant Apple Podcast, because she's got an iPhone.
Right.
So she was like, in my phone, I'll go and, look. So she will actively go and look to see if there's a new podcast. I don't know if she has notifications or anything like that set up. But when I saw that, I said, well, wait a minute. This is mainstream behavior then, because my wife is not techie. If she's going to her YouTubes and subscribing to pages on YouTube and then finding them in Apple and subscribing there, so if she's on the go, she can listen to it. This lets you know you can afford to not use at minimum these four strategies that you've told us so far to ensure that your podcast has the biggest reach ever. Let me ask you this, Joe. It would be foolish to work on all of these listeners and downloads without actually growing your list. And we don't have time to go into the reasoning why. Just know this. If you've been listening to this podcast, you understand how important measuring the performance of your marketing is. Effective marketing always generates leads and converts those leads to customers. Now, if you have a podcast, you when you said I want to do podcasting, you also said I need to have a list grown from my podcast. You may not know that you said that, but you did say it. All right. So do not settle for just listeners and subscribers. Make sure you have a means of taking them somewhere else so you can stay in contact with them outside of the podcast and continue to add value. What are some of the things that, some of the ways, I'll say one or more ways that you have seen effective use of doing just that? You've got the listeners, they've taken your strategies and they're like, wow, look at my downloads. How can they make sure that they can also say, oh, wow, and look at my email list?
Yeah, this is great, right? And you do the big box store method, right? Or the any store method, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, oh yeah, as you're checking out, oh, what's your email address? They just ask so casually,
They do.
right?
Hey, real quick, Joe, it took me a little bit to find out that I could say no.
Yeah,
I used to didn't think I could say no. I used to think that was part of the checkout process. And now
yeah,
I'm like, no, thank you. And they just continue on. I was like,
yep,
oh, I could say no.
yeah. I would always. I mean, yeah, I'm like a very forward New Yorker, so I'm like no or why. And
Right,
if someone's like, I
right,
have to put a phone number in, I'm like, well, you better make something up. I'm not giving you
right.
my real
Yeah,
number, right?
yeah,
But like they just do it so casually, and like most people don't even think about it, right?
yeah.
It's not as seamless with the podcast, but that's what you got to do. So here's what I recommend. Most
Hmm.
people save their calls to action to the till the end of their podcast. You've lost like 40% of your listeners by your sign off, right? Like look in
Mm,
Apple Podcasts, look at the engagement, watch that line go down. You know where you have everybody's
mm,
attention? The very beginning, right? So
mm.
here's what I like to do.
Okay.
I try to keep it real short.
Yeah.
I say real quick before we get started. If you like this podcast, I want to tell you about a free resource I have called the Podcast Swap Database. You
Mm.
can go get it over at whatever/swap. Put your email address in, and you will get the exact system I use to grow my podcast. All right. Again, that URL is blah, blah, blah. Now let's get on with the show.
Come on, Joe. Come
Yeah.
on. Listen, everybody, I'm guilty of that. You all have listened to my podcast. You know, some of you while you were listening was like, "Ooh, Chris does that." So just know I am changing my ways from this podcast on. Thank you for that, and keep
Yeah.
going, Joe. Keep going.
Yeah. I mean, everybody does that, right?
Hmm.
It's the natural point, right? It's like
Yeah.
the credits at the end of the show.
Yep. Yep.
Oh, well, you've listened, you've probably got value. Now I want to show you. And some people will argue, right? If you hit them with a call to action before you've provided them with any value, you're eroding trust. I don't think so. If someone's not willing to sit through 30 or 45 seconds of me giving them another free thing, they're not my
Yeah.
target.
Yeah.
They're not my target,
Yep.
right? Maybe
Yep.
this doesn't work for, again, a true crime podcast because you're getting people from all walks of life. Or maybe it's like, hey, sign up over here and we'll send you pictures of the crime scene or whatever, you weirdo. Like, so like
Yeah.
maybe it still does work for that, right? But hit them at the beginning and then mention it. I would say this is something I need to be better at because I'm like
Hmm.
really into the conversation usually when I'm talking to somebody. But
Hmm.
or if it's my solo show, like I'm really into like delivering the information. But try to do it a couple times throughout the episode, right? Because you only have like half of someone's attention.
Yeah.
New stats came out earlier this year as we record this. Um, that says like 50% of people who listen to podcasts are doing something else. At least, or maybe it was 70%, but like
Mm.
50, it's like while they're driving.
Wow.
36% while they're at the gym. 40% while they're cooking or baking, right?
Yeah.
I'll listen to a podcast. I pick the worst times to listen to podcasts. It's while I'm getting my kids ready for school where it's like chaos. And it's while I'm cooking dinner for my kids because my wife's a nurse, so she works 12-hour shifts. So on the day she works, I have my kids uh, the whole time, right? And
Yeah.
so um, I pick them up from school. We'll listen to a podcast in the car. And then I'm gonna keep listening to that, and I'm cooking, and they're running around screaming, and
Yep.
I barely hear what they're saying, right? So you need
That's
to
good.
repeat yourself.
Yeah.
You need to repeat yourself, and so like just mention it a couple times. By the way, that free resource, it's over at whatever, right? Ramit Sethi does this really well on his "I Will Teach You to Be Rich" podcast.
Mm.
He'll like answer a question, solve a problem, and then he'll be like, by the way, like if you want to dig more into that, go to here. And he has multiple calls to actions. He has a huge audience and covers a bunch of things. I would recommend like keep it to one or at
Yeah.
least one per episode based on the topic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Amy Porterfield does that really effectively. She'll have like 4 or 5 opt-ins, and based on the topic of her episode that day, she'll promote the most relevant one.
Okay. And I'll double down on that and add to it to say make sure how you're sharing is easy on the ears and easy to type in. So if
Mm-hmm.
your podcast name is very complicated, then just get another URL, a shorter one that you're going to use specifically for giving stuff away on your podcast. And for me, I never use a raw or naked URL, meaning if I do automationbridge.com/community is one that's been on the screen. Best believe that's not going to a web page /community. It's extending, it's a redirect, it goes somewhere else. And that way I can track who's coming from the podcast by using UTM parameters. This is very technical talk, but just let me say, I can track the URL, I can track where you came from by doing some stuff in the URL. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And now I've got downloads, Joe, and then I could go into my analytics and say, I can also see how this podcast is generating visitors to my website. For my techie folks. All right, non-techie folks, just pause for a second. My techie folks, use these UTMs in the UTM content. Put your episode number. The source is clearly your podcast, and then the medium could be whatever you want it to be. But put the episode number in as your UTM content, and if you want to use for the keyword the topic, you've got even more, or the category. So if you've really got your content on your website categorized really well, put the category in the keyword. Now you can see which categories are driving people to your website.
Man, now you're teaching me, right? I After our interview, I started using UTM codes a lot more. I
Yes.
found like there's like a website like utmbuilder.net or whatever that I've
Yep.
been using.
Yep.
But episode number in the content, that's so smart, right? Now
Yes.
that so for the ones that I set up, right? I'm using Transistor as my host, and they allow for a dynamic pre-roll. And so
Mm-hmm.
for that, like I just have like the generic like promo.
Yep.
But you know, if I'm gonna do that for the URL I'm gonna share later, right?
Yep.
I'm gonna
Yep.
include a bunch of stuff in the UTM code so that I know, hey,
Yeah. And
yeah.
you don't have to do it for everyone. I can be a little heavy handed because I worked in with these startups, and you just never knew anything. Like, you've got hundreds of thousands of users and listeners. There could be one piece of content that really
Mm-hmm.
changes everything. So I need to know what that is. Most people aren't to that level. So just use your standard, podcast episode. And if the category is there, whatever, but because you have to create a new link for every episode, which by the way, I use Airtable to automatically generate all of those types of URLs. But that's another topic, another day. Definitely not here. Because while I have you, Joe, I wanted to ask you one more thing, because this has been very, very, very helpful and informative for me. So I know it is for my audience. I want to talk about sponsorships. And I know that this is like an entire workshop. In fact, Joe, I do this often. I get inspired in the moment. I may have you come on and do a private training on sponsorships for the community membership. But here's the premise. I have a friend who has a very low in terms of visibility podcast. Generates almost $10,000 in sponsorships. Right? I'm gonna tell you why I believe in a minute. Then I have another friend who has a very large following and is struggling to just make some type of money from the podcast, right? But people love listening, so it appears, right? Now, on one side, the guy who has less of less visibility, he's in a very niche market, like not techie either, but very niche. I think it's like energy or something like that, right? And then my other buddy who's got a much bigger following, it's a much more saturated and techie market. So for you, I just wanted to say, I saw that and I was like, oh, episode numbers or the amount of episodes you have are not a factor in getting sponsorships, at all. I've seen people get sponsorships after 10 episodes, don't know how they did it, but there's definitely a strategy to it. Give us, kind of like the quick hitters approach to getting your first sponsorship, and what are the things that people are or companies are looking for in order to do that, because the belief is I don't have a big enough following. I don't have enough downloads. So is that true, Joe, or is there's something else that we need to know about sponsorships?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this. I have 3 podcasts, or I had 3 podcasts. All 3 of them were sponsored before episode 1 went live. All 3 of them, right?
Wow.
First one was a whim. That was like, I shot my shot, right? Some guy asked for a backlink, and I said, well, I don't do backlinks, but for $99, you can sponsor the first episode of my podcast.
Just ask.
System got better.
Listen.
Just ask.
That
Ask, don't get. I say that to my kids all the time.
Just ask. Wow.
Yeah. I say that to my kids all the time. My daughter will walk into the kitchen and stare up at the pantry and then look at me and then look at the pantry. And I'm like, what do you want?
Say it.
Don't ask, don't get.
Yep. Use your vowels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you got to ask. But you hit the nail on the head there, right? The reason that guy sponsored the first episode was it was the same audience for my blog where he was asking for the backlink. It was a very targeted audience. It was WordPress developers. He knew he wanted to reach WordPress developers and that I was a trusted voice in the WordPress development space. And so we got to go back to what we talked about earlier. Your mission statement. Who are you helping? Right? Because if you're not helping anybody or you're helping everybody, brands don't want that, right? But if you are helping, again, if I'm helping coaches, course creators, and authors build their authority through podcasting, well, now I can think of 5 to 10 companies off the top of my head who want to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I'll get them to sponsor my podcast. I just did this, actually. I pitched a potential sponsor. I said, I'm thinking about doing this series. I think you'd be a great presenting sponsor for the series. Are you interested? They said, yeah, I'm interested. We don't have a big marketing budget. We're a pretty small company. What did you have in mind? But you know what? I got him in the door. Now it's negotiation time. And this is the other thing you need to remember. Everything's negotiable. But I'm going to steal this from my friend Justin Moore, Brand Deal Wizard, right? He said there are 3 types of campaigns, right, of advertising campaigns. There is direct ROI or conversion campaign, right? This is where if I want to sponsor your podcast, I know for every $10 I spend, I make $100. So if your podcast can't do that for me, I'm not going to sponsor. This is the Casper mattresses, the Squarespaces, the HelloFreshes. This is why they're sponsoring the huge podcasts that have millions and millions of downloads.
Sure.
They're looking for mass market penetration.
Yep.
Then there is the brand awareness, right? I'm going to just spoiler alert. I forget the third one, but brand awareness is really where I want to hit home here. Mm-hmm. They just want influential people talking about their product.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And so this is why, even though your friend who does not have a lot of downloads can get sponsors, because he's in a niche or a niche where he is viewed as an expert talking about these companies.
Yeah.
This is why I was able to get sponsored so well, right? Because again, yes, I have more downloads than most podcasters, right? But there are, again, trusted voice in the WordPress space. Companies want to be attached to that. Oh, did you hear Joe's talking about us? Right. This is why people get YouTube videos from me too. I
Mm,
charge $1,500 a YouTube video, and look at the views they get. It's like tens, maybe hundreds on a long enough time scale. But that's not the point. The point is they can now take that video and share it with their audience and say, look, you know that guy Joe Casabona? He's using our product to
mm,
talk about this thing.
mm-hmm.
So this is what, if you want to get sponsors, this is what you need to focus on. Um, Figure out your niche. Who are you talking to? Reach out to companies who are trying to help those same people and show them that your audience needs their product.
Mm,
Justin will say, ask your audience, what do they want? What do they want to hear about? What tools do they need help with?
yeah.
And then their answers, you can just take them. This is why you got to build your list too, right? Because
Yeah.
you need someplace to ask these people this question. And then you could say like, hey, I'll use a previous sponsor. Hey, Riverside. Um, I was wondering if you want to sponsor my, there's like a better pitch method for this, but I have an audience of creators and podcasters who are looking for a better way to record their podcast. And they've specifically asked me about this. I use Riverside. I think you're great. Would you want to sponsor my podcast? That got a yes. They sponsored like 6 episodes, right? And
Mm,
so um, this is what you want to look for: brand aware people who are looking for brand awareness, because they
yeah.
care less about the downloads and more about the chatter,
Yeah.
whoever's doing.
I've got to agree with this because you know what? Sometimes I'll go to like a virtual event registration page or somebody's website that's not prominent. They're not a big figure in the space. And, you know, if it's an event that they're running or a podcast or something, I'll see sponsors and I'll be like, that's a pretty big company. Now, granted, I understand connection, relationship, and all of that. A lot of times you can leverage somebody that you know to make that intro to get your first sponsor. But I don't care how it comes about. I think the biggest thing here is understanding that the ask is the most important aspect of it. Is you asking, hey, would you like to? Hey, I do this, or hey, my audience is this. I think they would love your platform. Would you like to XYZ? I mean, if somebody asked me, it puts the onus on me to figure out why would I say no? And if I don't have a reason to say no and I truly see a benefit, thank you for reaching out to me because I didn't realize you had this audience. I didn't realize you
Yeah,
existed in this capacity, you know?
absolutely. And you want to make their job as easy as possible, right? So don't just say, do you
Yeah.
want to sponsor my podcast? Say, hey, I think you'd be great. Here's what I can do for you. Blah, 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 blah. Right.
Yeah. What's in it
And the
for
last
them?
thing I'll say here, by the way, that third type of campaign is repurposing, which is why I always forget it, because a lot of people aren't repurposing podcasts, like
Mm-hmm.
podcast episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like if you're doing like short form video or even YouTube videos, like, there's a repurposing campaign where the brand is just going to pay you so they don't have to pay someone in house to make that content, right? And you could charge a
Yeah.
lot for that, right? Because
Yeah.
that they're you're saving them money. But I'll also say this, right? Um, it's not just about downloads.
Okay.
It's about your overall reach, right? And so I tell my students, calculate your overall reach.
Mm.
Maybe you only get 10 downloads an episode, but maybe you have 5,000 YouTube subscribers. Maybe you have 2,000 people on Instagram and 1,000 people on your mailing list. Well,
Yeah.
that's just, I should use set numbers because then I add them up and I have to remember what I just said. But it sounds like you have 8,010 people in your audience, right?
Yeah.
Um, Run that back and do the math properly, I guess. But I think I said 5,000, 2,000, 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so then you could say, hey, if you sponsor my podcast, I'm going to do something that iHeartRadio would never do for you or Joe Rogan would never do for you. I'm also going to mention you in my mailing list. I'm going to give you a shout
Mm.
out in my next YouTube video. Maybe I'll do a live stream where I talk about your product. I'll do an Instagram reel or a TikTok video for
Yeah.
you as well if you sponsor my podcast. Now you're adding value for them and you're getting them on more platforms and you're integrating your entire audience and not just your podcast audience. And then you can make that self-referential, right? So you could say,
Yeah.
hey, this episode is brought to you by whoever, These are the reasons I love them. If you want to see me using their product, check out this YouTube video I did for them recently. The
Yep.
link is in the show notes.
Yep. Yep. And it's doable, everyone, because as an avid YouTuber in terms of watching more than the consumption of people watching mine, although we're improving that, I see channels of all capacities having sponsors, pausing and showing, doing some product placement and everything. So I think it's definitely something that you need to keep on the table and don't eliminate yourself from being able to do. Joe, this has been amazing. I have the tendency, as you know, I'll keep this conversation going, but I want to not want to. I have to, come to an end. For our listeners' sake, I want to respect your time and everything. There'll be more Joe for us who are in the community, because, like I said, I'll extend the invitation and get you to come in and do a training for us. But in the meantime, people have heard you talk about podcasting, promoting the podcast, getting sponsorships, and in there is peppered with some technical advanced strategies here and there. If they want to connect with you, find out more about you, follow you, what's the best way to connect with you, Joe?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to set up this page for you. Let's see, can I bring it up on the screen here? I don't know if it's going to be it's
Ah.
over at it's over at podcast. Well, you got to fill out the rest. Podcastliftoff.com/Chris. And I'll have there a free resource that is my sponsorship templates. So this is going to be a template of my pitch deck that I send to potential sponsors. It's going to be email templates that I send to potential sponsors, responses and things like that, as well as a little tracker. So if you go to podcastliftoff.com/Chris, you can get that totally for free. I'll also have a link there to my my podcast mastery course, where it's over 100 videos. It's like Netflix for podcasting, everything I've ever learned. There'll be a little discount there as well. So again, that's podcastliftoff.com/Chris.
Listen, do you all see this? This pleases my heart. Now, granted, there's a whole, when I say this, so those of you listening, I'm pointing on the screen to how Joe has conveniently placed his call to action to where you can see it. So if you, for whatever reason, didn't hear it right, it's right there on the screen. You could type it in as you're going. These are small things, Joe, small things that really show, one, your understanding of podcasting, but also eliminate any barriers that
Hey,
can,
if you're watching on a Mac, go ahead and take a screenshot, and then when you open it in preview, you could just click that link.
I didn't know that. Actually, let me do that. I'm gonna try myself.
I have a
didn't
little
know.
shortcut that like does it all in one fell swoop. Takes a screenshot, copies the text on my clipboard.
Stop it. Stop. See, this is the problem. Hold
This
on.
is how we get sidetracked.
Let me take this off the screen, because I listen. Oh my gosh, Joe, this is exactly what happens, everybody. So you get a little bit of insight, but listen, just let me be honest here. Let me level. How long have I been in the marketing automation space? Over a decade now. You just heard me on a podcast with a fellow business owner that does automation too, learn at least 3 things, not just about podcasting, automation. So if that doesn't show you the depth of this space and how you should never settle for whatever you think you know. You may think you're at the top of a mountain, but for someone else, that's just a little crevice inside of their bigger mountain, right? So you've never arrived. You're always improving. And as long as you remain teachable and willing to invest in your continued growth, that's exactly what you'll get back, is growth. So Joe, thank you for growing me. Thank you for growing my audience with this podcast, man. It's greatly appreciated. Listeners, thank you for your time. Thank you for your ears. And for those of you who have taken action and already gone to that URL or the URL that was on the screen for the community joining, thank you in advance. Everybody, listeners and beyond, continue to automate responsibly, my friends. Joe, thanks for coming on, man.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.
All right.